minitam yana tashmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Sri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yana Bhutare Swayam Rupa Karamayam Dharati Swaparantikam Vandeham Sri Guru Siyata Parakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavam Sri Rupam Sagatatam Sahagana Raganatam Vitam Stam Sadevam Sadvaitam Sabadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakan Vitam Stam Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinu Bandhu Jigapate Gopisha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mater Mater Gati Matsa Vasha Param Boja Radhana Madana Moharam Sriman Rasa Rasa Rambi Bamsi Bad Karsan Venershan Upake Gopinata Sri Sanhan Divyad Bindarani Kapatu Mata Srimad Ratnagara Shima Shanashto Shri Radha Shila Govinda Her Prestalavi Sevamanosh Marami Namo Brahmanya Devaya Go Brahmanya Taya Chajigari Taya Krishnaya Govindaya Namo Namaha Mangalam Bhagavan Vishnu Mangalam Guru Ajujam Mangalam Padidikaksho Mangaraya Tano Hari Om Narayanaya Vidmahi Vasudevaya Dhimahi Tano Vishnu Pachodyatehem Om Mahadevi Chavidmahi Vishnu Patniti Dhimahi Tano Lakshmi Pachodyatehe Mahalakshmi Namastubhyam Sare Sare Hari Priyamashram Namastubhyam Dadite Tapti Kanjana Gonangi Radhe Vindavaneshwari Vishabhanasute Devi Pranamani Hari Priya Namaha Om Vishnu Paraya Krishna Vishnaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swami Tinamane Namaste Sarasati Devi Gurani Pacharini Nirvishes Sanivadi Praskada De Sadharini Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shiva Sari Gaur Bhaktavindam Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare. Welcome to Wisdom Wednesday, the third in our three-part series this week. Still talking about the pastime of Gajendra. In fact, we haven't even got to the point where Gajendra enters stage front. We're still discussing the context, the heavenly atmosphere in which all this drama takes place. Speaking of drama, also, both Saturday night in Salt Lake City and Sunday, we're going to have a short presentation by one of the original Vaikuntha players. His initiate is Prem Purushottam. He's Canadian, lives in Saranagati, a devotee community in British Columbia, and he's touring the national parks in Utah, and he'll be swinging back through here on the weekend and doing a little mini 10-minute drama about an episode in the Mahabharata when Yudhishthira comes upon his father in the shape of a heron in the middle of the lake, and the heron challenges Yudhishthira to answer some of his riddles before drinking the water. It's a very dramatic, fascinating segment of the Mahabharata, and Prem Purushottam will give a excellent rendition of it, I'm absolutely certain. So if you're able to come, please do so. That would be Salt Lake City from 7 to 8:30, including Prasadam, and from 5 to 6:30 in Spanish Fork, including Prasadam as well. Good morning, Carmen. Good morning, Brent. Thank you both for joining me, as well as Rob, also over there on Zoom. We are, as I mentioned, discussing the context in which this famous celebrated pastime of Gajendra takes place, and what we're reading right now towards the 19th verse in the second chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam is to do with the water. It's explained that the water, and of course Gajendra is within the water, he's cavorting in the water. The water itself is very fragrant and very tasty. Now, not only is the water in this Trikud mountain area fragrant and tasty, but the demigods and demigoddess who sport habitually in this water are also themselves fragrant. They have bodies which exude a certain fragrance. In fact, it's explained that the fragrance which emanates from the bodies of the demigods puts to shame the fragrance which emanates from the flowers themselves. Now we just imagine now, the water is fragrant, and those who sport in the water, the demigods and demigoddesses, are also fragrant. And what happens here? There's kind of a competition that takes place. The water makes those who bathe in it more fragrant. Those who bathe in the water make the water itself more fragrant. There's an example that the turtle, when it swims into the water, it bumps the lotus flower. And when the turtle bumps the lotus flower, the pollen of the lotus flower falls into the water, making the water even more fragrant than it already was. So similarly, when the demigods and demigoddesses bathe in the water, they make the already fragrant water more fragrant, and the water makes the already fragrant demigods more fragrant. Now, contrast that with our bodies and our bodies of water here on this earth planet. We've hardly find any pure body of water left anymore, with all of the chemicals and toxins and effluvia from industry that goes into our waterways, and the acid rain which drops from above into it. You'll hardly find any water, and there are so many instances where at least stagnant water which is not running, becomes very smelly, distasteful, backed up with garbage and discarded items. Then consider our own bodies. This is the Kali Yuga age. Most people are dabbling, if not fully immersed, in the mode of ignorance. The mode of ignorance is characterized by a lifestyle where one doesn't eat properly. One doesn't eat grains and fruits and vegetables, whole foods, eats processed foods, junk foods, salty foods, excessively sweet foods, foods with a lot of sugar, foods with a lot of corn syrup, on and on and on and on. No proper eating. Most people don't exercise adequately. They don't burn enough calories. And when you take in more calories than you burn, the result is that turns into excess weight. The vast majority of people, never before in the history of the world, have a greater percentage of the people been overweight. You go to India, go to Thailand, Indonesia, you'll not find very many people overweight because they work. They're agriculturalists, and they work and they get exercise. One thing I always noticed whenever I lived in Paris for 6 months, and I've stopped over in Paris a couple of times on my way to India, had a 24-hour layover. So going in Paris, people are very thin. Also, they get lots of exercise in Paris, but that's what that's worth. But people don't eat properly. They overeat. They under-exercise. They eat when they're not hungry. So they're living in a tamasic mode, a mode of ignorance. And as a result, the body is exuding all kinds of unpleasant aromas. This reminds me of a story in the Bible about a vegetarian named Daniel. Daniel was captured, I think, by Nebuchadnezzar when he conquered that area, Israel, Palestine. And he was a young man with a lot of promise, good looks, good, well education, very sharp, devoted, pious, righteous, honest. And Nebuchadnezzar, what he would do is he'd take the best and the brightest from the lands that he conquered. He would bring them to his court. He would flatter them. He would treat them like his own sons. And he would groom them to be departmental heads, to administer his kingdom. In all of this, Daniel and his friends, who were vegetarian, they were okay with the plan, the overall plan, but they would not eat the food that was offered to them. They would not eat the meat because they were vegetarians. Nor would they bow down to the gods there. Apparently, Nebuchadnezzar worshipped demigods. We acknowledge the presence of demigods. We don't deny that for the management of universes, both material and spiritual, there needs to be staff. Spanish Fork is a town of 40,000 people, and they probably have at least 500 people on their payroll to take care of streets and water and electricity and power and grooming the trees and keeping the parks nice and well manicured. If a small town like Spanish Fork has 500 people on the payroll, do you think that the universe itself is just running on autopilot? We acknowledge that there are many, many demigods. However, they are not worshipable. Yepi anya devada yajanti tebi maman abidi yanjanti abidi porvakam. Just like you don't bribe the policeman who pulls you over for speeding. That's another crime. And maybe it's a worse crime than the speeding in the first place. The policeman writes you a ticket and you pay that fine to the government. You don't try to get out of it by paying a similar or lesser amount to the officer. That will get you into more trouble. So there are demigods. There's no question about it. Just common sense tells us that God, in his omnipotency, expands himself into demigods. In the local culture, they have a saying, as man is, God was, as God is, man will become. And that gets them in a lot of trouble with the mainstream Christians, because you can't become God. That's an essential truth. God means one. There's a big no vacancy sign up there. We cannot become capital G, capital O, capital D. But we can become godly or godlike by worshiping him. You become like that with whom you associate. And so by chanting the holy name of the Lord and associating with the Lord in subtle sound vibration, we become godly or godlike, or if you prefer, demigods. We don't say as man is, God was, as God is, man will become. That's blasphemous. But we say as demigod is, man will become, as man is, demigod was. So these are empowered living beings who are in charge of electricity, air, water, crops in this enterprise called this material world. Lord Brahma is the chief demigod. He created everything. He engineered everything. He structured the 8,400,000 bodies for the living beings for the souls to enter into. Now, having said that, we don't worship demigods apart from Krishna. The demigods are the servants of Krishna. So we acknowledge the demigods. We appreciate the demigods. And in as much as they're devotees of the Lord, from that point of view, sometimes we appear to be worshiping demigods, but we're not worshiping them as if they were separate or independent or equal to God. Sometimes we worship Lord Shiva on Shivaratri because he's the greatest of all devotees. So we're worshiping as a devotee, that he may give us mercy. We can't make advancement without the favor of other devotees who are further along on the path. So there is worship of Lord Shiva at a certain time of the year. There's even a Shiva temple in Vrindavan that people stop at and worship Lord Shiva on the way into Vrindavan to ask the blessings of the pure devotees. But that's not the same thing as worshiping demigods as independent of Lord Krishna. Worshiping demigods separately is offensive. It's like worshiping the servant in front of the master. One doesn't do that. And the servant himself or herself would be highly embarrassed to be worshipped in the presence of the master. So there are demigods, but we don't worship them. I hope that we made that clear. And the demigods, so anyway, it reminds me of this story of Daniel. Daniel wouldn't eat the food. He wouldn't bow down to the demigods that Nebuchadnezzar worshipped in his kingdom. So Nebuchadnezzar, he liked the young man. He liked the young man a lot, and he didn't want to harm him, in spite of the fact that he was kind of thumbing his nose at Nebuchadnezzar and the status quo. But Nebuchadnezzar's advisors, who didn't like this import from Palestine anyway, they put a lot of pressure on him. You can't let this guy, you can't make an exception of this guy, because then nobody will worship, nobody will respect your authority, and there'll be a revolutionary atmosphere. So they said, make an example of him. And as you all know, he threw him in a lion den. In the evening, they tossed him in to a den of hungry lions, locked the door, they went to sleep. In the morning, someone came to Nebuchadnezzar and said, you got to check this out. You won't believe this. So he looked through into the lion's den. Daniel had been there all night. And they were all getting along really well. Daniel was lying. One of the lions was a footstool, and one of the lions was a pillow. And everybody was sleeping very peacefully. Reminds me of that verse in the 10th canto of the Bhagavad Gita, the kingdom of God, Vaikuntha, the land where the Lord predominates, is the peaceable kingdom. The lion will lie down, eat straw with the ox. There's no enmity. In this material world, there's naturally enmity between species and between man and beast. There's no enmity in the spiritual world. So there was no enmity between Daniel and the lions. Why? Because he'd never eaten meat. He'd never eaten flesh. And the lions sniffed him. That's the first way that animals like lions and dogs make their assessment, whether you're a threat or not, is through smell. Their smell faculties are many thousand times more acute than ours. So just by sniffing Daniel, the lions determined that he'd never eaten an animal. He'd never committed violence, perpetrated violence on any animal. He'd never ingested flesh. His body did not stink like the body of the flesh eaters. Imagine all that dead flesh. Imagine the fear chemicals that are shot through into the animal at the time of being killed in the slaughterhouse. Horrible environment, terrifying environment. Imagine on top of that, all the chemicals that are injected into the dead flesh so it doesn't rot. Once the soul leaves the body, the flesh is going to rot within 24, 36 hours. There's going to be E. coli, there's going to be all kinds of bacteria. It's not going to be safe to eat. And so in order to get that flesh to you 2 or 4, 6 or 8 weeks later, they have to put all kinds of preservative chemicals in it too, which are not very conducive to fragrant bodily aroma. All this adds up to the fact that we eat not properly. We eat what we take in. We're basically eating violence and all kinds of chemicals. We're overeating. We're eating when we're not hungry. We're eating after dark. We get up in the morning. We eat snacks all through the day. We overeat, and the result is our body stinks. And an animal with a good sense of smell, like a lion, can immediately determine. When they sniffed Daniel, they thought, he's never done any harm to us. Why should we harm him? And that way he passed the night very congenially and very safely. When the lions are on your side, there's not much that anybody else can do to you, is there? So this is common. This is the standard in the planets of the demigods. Should you become a demigod in your next life, and I would hope much more for you, I'd hope you could skip that and go directly back home, back to Godhead. But the demigods are devotees who their devotion is mixed with some desire to control. So they don't go directly back to the kingdom of God at the time of leaving their bodies, but they're promoted within this material world to areas of greater responsibility. They serve the Lord, but they also serve the Lord with the condition that they get some influence, some stature, some power. Now, if you should take birth as a demigod, and I often muse, it's a private thought of mine, that Mormons, with their emphasis on progression and becoming God, small OG, some of our Mormon friends have even gone so far as to confide in us that in the next life they are scheduled to create their own universe, found dynasties and all. So it sounds very much to me like the goal of Mormonism in large part is to become Brahma, to become a Brahma in one's next life. So if you, any of you to whom I'm talking right now, should find yourself as a demigod in the next life, as a Brahma, know that you've kind of missed the mark. You know, you didn't get the bullseye. You got one of the outer rings. You improved yourself, but only temporarily, because after the expiration of a long lifespan as a demigod, when all of the sum total of one's pious credits runs out, one has to again come back down and take birth as a human being. But in the interim period, compared to life on Earth, life on the planets of the demigods, life in the area where this pastime of Gajendra takes place, is far better. It's far more pleasurable. The standard of living is higher. The lifespan is much, much longer. One of the features of the demigods is that their feet do not touch the ground. We talked about them being fragrant, that their fragrance is so great that the flowers are ashamed. They make the water in which they bathe more fragrant. When we bathe, we're washing off. I read an article in a tabloid akin to the National Enquirer once said that every night when we go to bed, between the time we go to bed, our head hits the pillow and we rise in the morning, we've shed 10,000 dead skin cells. There are 10,000 dead skin cells. That's why we wash our pillowcases, wash our sheets. And that's why hopefully first thing you do when you get up is take a shower, because there's 10,000 dead skin cells that have congregated on your epidermis just in the course of 8 hours sleep. And these are all very, disgusting. If you get it down to the microscopic level, even the most beautiful girl or handsome man in this material world, the body is not a pleasant, not to be compared with the bodies of the demigods, who exude fragrance. We exude bad smells and skin cells. So there is that. And then there's also the fact that the demigods' feet do not touch the ground. Here it's also explained that not only do the demigods' feet not touch the ground, but even their shadows don't touch the ground. So we have two facts here. They're fragrant, their feet don't touch the ground. And here's another fact, which is revealed in this 8th canto of the Bhagavatam. The demigods don't blink. Their eyes are unblinking. They don't waste time blinking. And if you notice, powerful people in this material world, they don't blink very often. Blinking is a sign of nervousness, a lack of confidence. People who are going places, people who are going to make their mark, are generally people who don't blink a whole lot. And I have a story about this from the Mahabharata. There was a beautiful princess. She was the daughter of Swayambhuva Manu, I believe it was. And Manu was traveling in a remote part of the Himalayas with his army, and he happened to have had his young 12, 13-year-old daughter along with him. They came into the area where sage Chyavana had been doing austerities for many years. In fact, Chyavana at this point was underground. He was suspending his in-breathing, out-breathing, and he was in this static state where he was underground. The young girl was out with her girlfriends, and she looked down and she saw this blue glowing orb at the bottom of a little anthole. Being curious, as kids are, she took a stick or twig and she prodded it. Now, that had been the eye of Chyavana, who was doing his meditation underground. She put out his eye. Now, immediately, the reaction to that unintended offense to the powerful sage was that the whole army of Manu became constipated. They weren't able to pass stool and urine. So after a few hours, they became extremely uncomfortable. You know that sepsis, I think it's sepsis, comes about when you can't eliminate stool and urine. It backs up, and it can be fatal. So the whole army of Manu, who keeps peace and order within this jurisdiction, was in danger of passing away due to sepsis. Now, Sukanya could have ducked her head down, played it low profile, just not said anything. But she had the highest character. She was very straightforward. She didn't want anyone to suffer on her account, much less her father and her father's armed forces. And so she went forward and she said, Dad, I think it might be because of something I did yesterday. She took him to the spot. They they excavated, and lo and behold, there's a sage with one eye poked out. And Manu tried his best to propitiate the sage, who was naturally a bit upset. And he said, my daughter was the cause of your discomfiture. So may I offer my young 12, 13-year-old daughter to you in marriage? Chyavana reluctantly agreed. He agreed to marry her, but he also had a grudge against her, because she'd put out his eye and disturbed his meditation. So Sukanya was such good character. She didn't protest. I mean, can you imagine 12, 13-year-old girl being given to this horrible, imagine what he looked like after living underground for so many years. And as far as we know, this wasn't on the plan of the demigods. Chyavana was probably on the calendar to become a demigod in his next life, but he wasn't a demigod this life. So we can only assume that the odors from his body were not fragrant like those of the demigods. He was wrinkled, matted hair, and quite old. Chyavana means one who's, in fact, aged. Imagine, a normal 12-year-old girl being told that there was an arranged marriage between her and such an old, ill-tempered, ugly, smelly guy. She'd probably do away with herself. But Sukanya wanted to do her duty. She accepted responsibility for her childish action. She wanted to serve her father, and she wanted to relieve people of suffering. She's a true devotee. So she began serving him, and he was very demanding. He never thanked her. He took her ministrations for granted. He even went out of his way to say harsh things to her because he still blamed her for his sightlessness. In all of this, one time, two of the demigods, the Aswini Kumars, remember their feet don't touch the ground. They're exuding a wonderful fragrance, and they don't blink. They happened to be passing through that neck of the woods, and they saw this girl being abused, essentially, by her crotchety old husband. So they proposed to Sukanya, why don't you come with us? We will treat you nicely. We'll install you in a palace in the heavenly planet. When you come to live with us in the higher realms, you'll also have a longer life, and your karma will change. She said, no, this is my husband. I've taken a vow, and the well-being of a lot of people, my father's army, my father, the status quo, all depend on me. And so I'm not going to be dissuaded from the virtuous course of action that I've taken. Then the twin Ashwins, they hatched a plot. They offered to help her out. They said, well, the least you can let us do is to restore your husband to his youth. This will not only give you a suitable young husband who will be more compatible, but if he gets his youth back and his sight back because of you, then he'll give up his grudge against you. In fact, he'll be very appreciative of you and grateful and loving, like a husband should be, rather than abusing you like he does now. So Sukanya thought, well, that doesn't sound too bad. And she brought it up to Chyavana, and Chyavana agreed. Yes, let me. By now, Chyavana was actually feeling a little remorse for the way he'd been treating his wife. He realized that it wasn't really her fault, and her childish innocence. A few years had gone by. She was probably 16 or 17 by now. And she'd served him very faithfully without any lip or arguing or complaining. She'd been the ideal. And so he was, in spite of himself, starting to feel genuine affection, genuine gratitude. So he thought, well, this might be a good way to pay her back. And he agreed that the twin Ashwins, who were actually physicians, they're like the cosmetic surgeons, like the Botoxers of the demigods, they had promised to restore his youth with their skills. So But they also had an agenda, which we'll find about shortly. They took Chyavana, the old crotchety, wrinkled, smelly body of the sage, and three of them immersed themselves in the nearby water. They were in the water, under the water for some time. And when they emerged, Sukanya was on the shore, waiting for the newer, revised version of her husband. When they emerged from the water, they'd switch positions. They didn't come out of the water in the same order they did. They were three abreast. They went into the water with Chyavana in the middle, but they didn't come out of the water with Chyavana in the middle. One of them was in the middle and Chyavana was on one side. And the ruse was that Sukanya, would not be able to recognize which one was her husband, and not being able to recognize her husband, she would pick one of them, after all, for her husband. So the three of them came out. Their order had been switched. They were still abreast. And they said, pick your husband. So a lesser woman than Sukanya could have actually discerned the ruse and just picked at random with a 2 out of 3 chance of upgrading her husband. Who would have blamed her? They looked exactly alike. Her husband and the twin, they looked exactly alike in every respect. You couldn't tell one from the other. So she could have just picked randomly. And she had a 2 out of 3 chance to trade in her mortal husband, who, in spite of looking really good now, still would age and still is subject to the shortcomings of life on earth. And she could have upgraded to a demigod husband, which meant she herself would have accompanied him to the higher planets, and she would get an upgrade herself. So who would have blamed her? This would seem like gift of God, a golden opportunity. But she wasn't interested in doing something less than ethical like that. She wasn't interested in, by some underhanded trick, or buying into the underhanded trick of the twin Aswins. She really, really wanted to choose her husband. And remember, of the three, he would be the best, the worst deal. He would be the worst deal. He got a reset. He's good, he's handsome and everything, but again, he's mortal, he's flesh. So the problem became, how do I pick my husband from amongst 3 men who look exactly the same? Are you guys on the edge of your seats? Those of you who don't know this story, have I got you dying to know how it turns out? Yeah. Are you eating your hearts out? What's going to happen now? All right, so this goes back to the quality, the third quality we talked about. The demigods are fragrant. They exude fragrance. They don't, not only do they not touch the ground when they walk, their shadow doesn't touch the ground, but the third feature is they don't blink. So as Sukanya scrutinized very carefully these 3 handsome, movie star, handsome personalities who had emerged from the lake, she saw two differences. She saw that between the 3 of them, there was one who didn't blink, the other 2 were unblinking, and she also saw that 2 of them had garlands which remained fresh and vibrant, and the garland of the third one was starting just a little bit to lose its luster and its freshness. And then again, she could have used that to her advantage. She could have said, well, this is my husband, so I won't pick him. How many women would have then been able to identify, not picked him, but chosen to improve themselves by switching to them? But she chose him. And here we are in Spanish for Utah, thousands and thousands years later. Had Sukanya done anything less than the most noble, had she taken any road other than the high road, had she taken the middle road or taken the lower road, we would not be celebrating her. We would not be glorifying her today. She kept true to her vow. She steered without distraction on the course of being a savior for her father and for her father's constituents. She had come into this earth to relieve others of misery, to sacrifice her happiness for that of others. And because everything that goes around comes around, now she's getting from an old crotchety husband who held a grudge. Now she's getting a doting, young, handsome, loving, grateful husband, and living happily ever after. Oh, you guys like that? You like the ending of the story? The Prabhupada says here, since the bodies of demigoddesses are so well formed and demigods, we can only imagine how well formed are the bodies of the damsels in the kingdom of God in Vaikuntha. Here's a verse from the 3rd canto, 15th chapter, 20th verse of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Yatsankaram Hari Parananti Matra Drishtir Vaiduri Manakata Hemur Mayur Vimanaha Yesham Brihat Kati Tata Shmita Shabhava Krishnatmanam Naraja Adadur Uchmayaraham. It's talking about life in the kingdom of God, which lies far above the heavenly planets. The demigods eventually come to that unfortunate time when they have to die and give up their bodies and then drop back down to an earthly atmosphere. But such is not the case in the kingdom of God. The living beings there have their eternal spiritual bodies. And it's said in the Vaikuntha planets, which are subordinate to Goloka Vrindavan, the Vaikuntha planets are characterized by opulence, palatial residences and protocol, majesty and awe. None of that exists in Krishna's supreme planet, Goloka Vrindavan. But that's the subject matter for another day. In the Vaikuntha planets, where the Lord resides and presides as Narayan, the four-armed personality of Godhead, it's explained that the inhabitants, they travel in these airplanes, these aerial vehicles, which are made of Vaidurya, emeralds, gold, and jewels. The planes themselves don't need gasoline. They don't spew out CO2. They don't pollute the air. They're just self-motivating. And it's said that they're compact. They're compact. They're not big boats. And so being compact, the husbands and wives in the spiritual world are kind of close together. You know, we've all had the experience of being on a crowded bus, and sometimes you're pushed up against somebody, almost uncomfortably so. Your chest is against their chest, your hips against their chest, because of the density of people in a crowded bus or a crowded train. So the husbands and wives are millions of times more beautiful, more attractive than the demigods and demigods that you just described. It is said particularly the women have narrow waists and broad hips and very full breasts. And they're fragrant, they don't touch the ground, that's all goes without saying. They're unblinking, and multiply all that 1,000 times over, and you've got some very, very attractive men and women there. Prabhupada says, if the demigods and goddesses are so well formed, such narrow waists and such beautiful hips and breasts, alluring breasts, he says, we can only imagine. Well, we can't. I mean, it's just a manner of speaking. We can't even imagine the demigods, what to speak of the Vaikuntha damsels, but Prabhupada uses this as a figure of speech. We can only imagine how well formed are the bodies of the Vaikuntha damsels. So in these compact aerial vehicles, which are made of lapis lazuli, emeralds, and gold, are crowded the husbands and their consorts, the wives and their spouses, in such a way that their bodily parts are bumping and rubbing against each other. And usually that's a formula for eroticism. Usually under those circumstances, certain parts of your bodies respond, almost unconsciously, almost reflexively. And yet, see, we jump from the bodies of humans on earth to how much better the bodies of the demigods are. We jump from how wonderful the bodies of the demigods compared to the bodies of people on earth to how much more wonderful are the bodies of the eternally liberated living beings in the Vaikuntha planets. But now we're going to jump to the ultimate level, which is that Krishna's body is the source from which all other attractive qualities come. There is nothing anywhere in the creation which did not have its origin in the original form of Krishna. So when you see Krishna, as Akura mentioned yesterday, we shared that quote with you. When you see Krishna, then everything else pales in comparison. There's no part of Krishna's creation which can even come close within 1,000,000 miles of comparing with the ultimate form of Krishna. And because all the inhabitants of Vaikuntha are 100% Krishna conscious, you don't elevate to the spiritual world. You don't go to the place where there's no birth, death, disease, and old age, unless you're purified by dint of service to and meditation upon Krishna. They are so enamored with Krishna that even though they have supremely excellent bodies, and even though they are in these compact, tiny aerial vehicles made of all kinds of precious jewels, and even though they are pushed up against each other, chest to chest, hip to hip, waist to waist, they are not stimulated to lusty desires because of their Krishna consciousness. They are 100% enamored with Krishna. They think only of Krishna. Their emphasis is not how can I stimulate temporarily my individual senses, but how can I please the senses of Krishna? Kama prema donakaravi lo arahim yaichirashan. So that's the essential difference between Krishna consciousness and material consciousness. That's the essential shift which comes about in the consciousness between those who are condemned to die and those who are never going to die. Those who are condemned to die always want to satisfy their own senses. It's all about me. Those who are never going to die, the senses are also there. They have senses. Our source, the Supreme Personality of God, is a sentient being. Otherwise, how could we be sentient if our source wasn't sentient? But the mentality of the eternally liberated souls who have left this material world and are never going to come back, not even as demigods, is that they want to please the senses of Krishna. And with that mentality, they are not stimulated to lusty interaction, even under those exceptionally provocative or potentially provocative circumstances. Yatpada pankaja palasa vilashara karmasam. There are many cases of big personalities. Chyavana Muni, after meditating under the earth, agreed to get married to a young 12-year-old girl. Subari Muni was with the fish. He came out and ended up with 50 wives and producing 100 sons out of each wife. Lord Shiva, meditation was broken by Mohini Murti. There are many cases of great sages and yogis, ascetics and gyanis having been disturbed and in whom lusty desires awakened even after having performed yoga and austerities for thousands of years. And yet devotees who may already be married, who may live in a city, who may have children, who may go to the office every day, have more sense control than these big personalities because they're engaged in the service of the Lord. Yatpada padkaja pilash. They have taken shelter in the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And as such, their only desire, their only thing that consumes them is the desire to satisfy the senses of the Lord. Because we're his parts and parcels, to satisfying the senses of the Lord is the highest way of satisfying, the highest and most sublime way of satisfying our own senses. And therefore it's concluded that the greatest of all sense controllers are the simple, humble devotees who are engaged in the service of the Lord, who associate with the Lord, who take the prasadam of the Lord, and always chant the names of the Lord. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Thank you, Brent, and Hare Krishna to you. Thank you, Carmen, the second one to jump on board. We don't see Gene today. I know he's in the hospital with cancer. Hope he hasn't taken a turn for the worst. This is the first day I can remember that Gene hasn't joined us. I'll reach out to him. Michelle and Greg, thanks very much. It was great to see you here in Spanish Fork last Sunday. If you joined us late this morning, we've got a special guest. He's going to do a 10-minute dramatic rendition, both in Spanish Fork and Salt Lake City this weekend. The title is The Lake of Death, but it's not really a morbid, it's actually a life-affirming rendition of an episode from the Mahabharata where the pious King Yudhishthira meets his father Yamaraj, who's taken the form of a heron in a lake. And before he's allowed to drink the quenching water of the lake, he's asked to respond to several riddles that his father gives him. So it's a great uplifting, purifying segment of the Mahabharata. And Prem Purushan is going to do a very expert, moving rendition of it. So come and see us if you're able to. Saturday night in Salt Lake City at 7, Sunday night in Spanish Fork at 5. Sundari Priya, thanks for coming on board. All glories to Prabhupada. Anjali, the queen of comments, is back. Bye, Bobby, my queen, is there. Anjali with a hand and a lotus flower in which the letters Bhakti. Mahatma, Haribo Mahatma, I follow all your posts, all your wonderful prasadam recipes on Facebook. Mahatma is the moderator of the Prasadarians Facebook forum. If you're not a member, or if you don't follow it, I would recommend it. All kinds of beautiful ruminations and realizations about prasadam. My Bobby comments here in Sanskrit, is there a different word for worship of God as opposed to worship of demigods? Demigods, cows, mothers, etc. I suspect it's a different word than the word kept only for worshiping the Supreme Lord. Well, I don't know about a word for worshiping the demigods, but the word for worshiping Krishna is bhaja. Bhaja means it's a word which is only reserved for the Supreme Personality. You can't bhaja a movie star, a celebrity, a sports icon, or a demigod. You can only bhaja the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And therefore it means more than worship. The closest word for bhaja in English is worship, but we do worship celebrities, sports icons, as well as demigods. But you don't bhaja those persons. So therefore the word bhaja does not exactly translate into worship. It means it's more specific than worship, which is an English term which can refer to your adulation directed towards almost anybody. I hope that made some sense. All right, moving on here. Anjali says, private thought of mine, not so private when it's a public Facebook speech. Yes, that's true. When you put your thoughts on Facebook, they're no longer private. And then her next comment is, can you clarify how going back to God is not the same as liberation, becoming a demigod? Nectar Devotion 4 and Prabhupada says no to liberation. Main difference is that going back to the spiritual world, you don't return again to this material world. You don't propel yourself up to the spiritual world by pious activities. Pious activities are the upside of impious activities. For performing pious activities, you get a good result. For performing impious activities, you get a bad result. But good and bad keep you within this material world. There are good segments of this material world where the pious goes, and then there are not so good segments of this material world where the impious goes. But whether you go up or whether you go down, you're still bound. However, by dint of devotion, which is another category of activities apart from the good and bad of this material world, you go to the spiritual world. And it's explained the difference between the heavenly planets where the demigods live and the Vaikuntha world where the devotees live is that demigods come back and the devotees don't. All right, Carmen, is this a poem? Let's see, I think it is. The highest state possible is at a rate improbable. Our minds can't define celestial words divine. But even this glory is not the whole story. Sweet Lord Hari is the end goal for me. You have a real talent. The highest state possible. You can't just read Carmen's verses and just like at one go. You have to study them. You have to study them. The highest rate possible is at a rate improbable. Our minds can't define celestial words divine. But even this glory is not the whole story. Sweet Lord Hari is the end goal for me. So that's a beautiful, intricate way of saying that, you know, the heavenly planets may seem like perfection from where we are, but we're forewarned that we should not set our soul goals, our sights on the heavenly planets because there's a far, far greater realm. We have to give up selfishness. We have to give up ego. We have to give up our own personal sense gratification. If we give up these things, these are the chains. This is the lodestone, which keeps us revolving in the cycle of birth and death in this material world. We have to transfer, not negate, but transfer our attachment, transfer our sense gratification to the service of the Lord. And that will take us beyond the place that words can describe. Well, very nicely and intricately expressed. All right, now, Rob, are you there? And can you share with us your own takeaways from this Wisdom Wednesday session?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.
So I've got what goes up must come down unless you chant the transcendental sound.
Nice, nice.
We cannot be the Lord of the earth, much less the universe. To think we can is just perverse.
There you go.
Pure devotees fulfill their responsibility instead of desiring insatiably.
Mm-hmm.
And those that die seek to satisfy. Those that don't die seek service in the spiritual sky.
Yes. I think by George, I think you've got it. I think you've got it. Well, thank you, both of our poets, Carmen and Rob, and thanks to Anjali for commenting profusely as she always does, and as well for Brent and my Bobby who jumped in to join us, as well as Mahatma. We're honored that Mahata has come to see us today, Sundari Priya, Michelle, and Jean. Everyone say a prayer for Jean. We'll be back next Monday for Motivational Monday, and on the weekend, I'll be giving talks both in Spanish Fork and Salt Lake City. I think I know the subject of the talk. The subject of the talk is new beginnings. Yes, we'll be talking about new beginnings. And affixed to my talk in the kirtans will be a little 10-minute drama by Prem Purushottam. If you're able, please come and join us. If not, chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.